All right, now we are on part 2 of our 3-column notes. We want to put our heading on first, name, number, date, first and last in cursive. And remember to write the date that you are actually working on these notes, not necessarily the date I am writing. My number's pi, and the subject is math. All right, we are looking at metric length. And just to make sure you're seeing, a millimeter is about this distance between my fingers here, this dime. So a millimeter is very, very small. And it takes 10 of these to make a centimeter. It takes 100 of these to make a decimeter, 1,000 of these to make a meter, and 1,000,000 of these to make a kilometer. Okay. So what we're looking at now, thinking about, is we're thinking about the dime, the ladybug, the place value rod, which is about that long, a baseball bat or golf club, or a city block. Those are the things we're going to picture to figure out which unit of measure would make the most sense in measuring the object listed. So if we wanted to measure the height of a house, would we use the measurement of that dime, stack them up and see how many? Would we use the measurement of a ladybug and stack them up and see how many, that length? Would we use place value rods and stack them? Would we use baseball bats and stack them? Or would we use city blocks? Well, a house is not usually as tall as 4 city blocks. Unless it's a skyscraper, potentially. So it's not usually as tall as 4 city blocks. So kilometers would not make sense. And it's too big to use a place value rod. A ladybug or dime. A baseball bat or golf club. Is the best size. So our work here is reasoning. Which length makes the most sense to use? And that baseball bat or golf club would make the most sense, because if you're using really tiny units, it can be hard to get accurate for a large size object like a house. And a kilometer is way too big unless you're living in a skyscraper. So since we're a baseball bat or golf club, it makes the most sense. Meters would be the most appropriate unit to use. Now we could use the other ones, but the one that makes the most sense is using the meter. Next, we're going to look at what is an appropriate unit for the distance traveled by a plane. The length of a golf club, place value rod, ladybug, or dime would be too small. If you wanted to see how far a plane traveled, you wouldn't want to put golf clubs end to end, that distance to measure it. The length of 4 city blocks is the best size, because that distance a plane travels is really, really big. All the other units would be way too small to put together to find that length. So using the 4 city blocks length would make the most sense here, because it's such a large distance. So kilometers would be the most appropriate unit to use. Next one, choose the most appropriate unit for the width of a strand of yarn. So yarn is not, we're not talking about the length where it winds up. We're talking about the width. So if we imagine, that's usually about this big, you know, a little frayed at the end. So yarn is usually about that big. And we're talking about this distance of yarn, the width of it, not the part that's wound up into the skein. Yarn is too thin to use the length of, now even a ladybug is bigger than that length. So I couldn't even use a ladybug because it would be bigger than the length of that yarn. A ladybug. A place value rod. Oops. A golf club. Or if you don't know what that looks like, a baseball bat. Or 4 city blocks. Those are much, much too big to be able to measure this little tiny width. Dime width would be the best size. So if I were to stack dimes for that width of the yarn, that would make the most sense to figure out the size, the width of that. So the size of that dime is millimeters. Millimeters would be the most appropriate unit to use. Okay, last one, we're looking at the length of a feather. It does depend on the bird, but most feathers are probably about this long right here. So if I couldn't use anything like a golf club or baseball bat. 4 city blocks would definitely be way too big. Even if I used a place value rod, which would be about this big, it wouldn't accurately measure that last part of the feather. So even that place value rod is a little bit too big. And if I wanted to stack dimes, that would be a little bit too small. So a feather is too small to use a place value rod. So that is your decimeter. A golf club or baseball bat. So that is your meter. Or 4 city blocks. That is your kilometer. It is too big to use dimes. Using the width of a dime, that would be far too many to stack up. So the unit of measure that makes the most sense would be the width or the length of a ladybug, or a centimeter. Oops, ladybug. There's an A in there. Is the best size. So that means centimeters. Would be the most appropriate unit to use. So again, just to think, millimeters, that width of a dime, very, very tiny. Centimeters would be about 10 of these, or the length of a ladybug. Decimeters is about the length of a place value rod. Meters is about the length of a baseball bat. And kilometers is about the length of 4 city blocks. So walking down Main Street, most of the length of the straight part of that, or much of that length. Okay, so let's go ahead and practice more with choosing appropriate measures in metric length. Thank you for joining me.